Yes.
Dr. Snape, before the break, you said, in reply to some of my questions about the relationship with the RTCs, that there was a role for BPL to go back to the RTCs and give them advice about the types of things they could be doing to improve plasma supply. Am I right in thinking that that was a role that you undertook yourself from 1982 in your audits of RTCs?
Certainly, it's something I set out to do. That doesn't mean I was the only person doing it, of course. I mean, I'm sure Richard Lane was going back to them. I'm sure in his different, in his different role, Norman Pettit was going back to them. But it was certainly something I felt I had to do.
Were you the only one of those three, you, Dr. Lane and Mr. Pettit, who went out to the RTCs to do these audits?
Oh, no. When David Donald came on board, he undertook both for-cause audits and routine audit visits. Stephen Jenkins, again, who joined us later, did the same thing. And often when I went, I would take a member of my team with me. So, for example, very often either Brian Combridge, who had responsibility for hepatitis testing and the hepatitis kit manufacturer at BPL, came with me, and sometimes Paul Harrison, who was the BPL virologist doing a lot of antibody testing, came with me.
Before you arrived in 1982, were such audits being undertaken, or did you introduce them?
No, I don't think so. I wasn't aware of them if they were.
They weren't being undertaken before you arrived, so you think you did introduce them?
No, as far as I'm aware, they were not being done before I arrived, and I saw it as being an obvious change to make.
You've divided them into the routine audits where you went and offered advice. And some of the things that you mentioned in your witness statement were on the way in which plasma was frozen and the type of packs being used, for example, optimizing freezing, storage and shipment were the examples that you gave. Those were the routine audits. And for-cause audits, were they reactions to specific events which had caused concern at BPL about plasma that had been supplied by an RTC?
That's correct. The other kind of interaction I was involved in, most obviously with Dr. Angela Robinson, was to, I would audit, not the RTCs, but I would audit supplies of bags to the RTCs because I had expertise that the transfusion centre didn't necessarily have.
I'd like to take you to an example of a for-cause audit. It's at CBLA 301599, please, Sully. We can see that this is a visit to the Liverpool Regional Transfusion Centre undertaken by you and Dr. Combridge, who you have just mentioned, Brian Combridge. It was undertaken on the 13th of July 1982, so not long after you moved to BPL. The purpose of the visit is described in the first paragraph, and I'll read from that. It says this: 2 5-litre plasma packs received from Liverpool RTC, the numbers are given, were tested for HB surface antigen at BPL and found to be positive. The component single donations tested by BPL RIA at Liverpool had all been reported as negative. The visit was intended to determine whether or not these occurrences reflected a basic insecurity of the testing method at Liverpool and that all single donation IPPs, international plasma packs, now being received from Liverpool would have to be retested at BPL, and you make reference to a letter. At the time the visit was arranged, the first positive pool had been identified as containing a donation which originated in the Isle of Man, where donations are tested by RPH only. The mechanism by which the second positive pool had arisen had not been identified. So if we just pause there before we turn to the conclusions of your visit. The situation, as we can see it from there, is that BPL have found 5-litre plasma packs to be positive at BPL, which have been reported negative at the regional transfusion centre. Is that right?
That's correct. And of course, it shouldn't have been possible because we were testing a diluted sample in the 5-litre packs, and the centre was testing a single donation. The specific example, the Isle of Man donation, which is tested by reverse passive hemagglutination, not RIA. Perhaps no surprise there if they were the source, but the second positive pool simply shouldn't have been possible if they were doing acceptable testing.
So your job on the audit was to try and find out what had happened and work out what further steps needed to be taken.
That's correct.
If we could turn to page 2, I won't go through the whole report, but we'll just turn to the conclusions. The section on conclusions reads as follows. The first missed positive had been identified as arising from plasma from another centre, the Isle of Man, at which only RPH testing was carried out. These donations have been treated interchangeably with plasma tested at Liverpool by BPL RIA and submitted to BPL as pools of RIA-tested plasma. All donations from the Isle of Man are now tested at Liverpool by BPL RIA before being dispatched to BPL. The second missed positive had been identified as arising from human error in interpretation of results, and a system of double-checking had been introduced, pending introduction of computer methodology, with a view to preventing a reoccurrence. So that is what you found during your audit. If I can ask this, how receptive were the RTC, both on this occasion and generally, to somebody from BPL coming along and identifying the flaws in their processes?
Actually, very receptive indeed. I can recall a couple of situations where in the interval between arranging the for-cause audit and travelling to the RTC, I'd either get a phone call, well, typically a phone call, because emails were less used, a very excited phone call saying, you don't have to come really, we know what the problem is, but you probably want to come anyway, don't you? And I always went, and it was good to be able to praise them for having identified the problem.
Am I right in thinking... Go on,
sorry,
please.
Go on. A classic one was an example where and it may well have been this Liverpool one, the centres were by and large using a particular piece of equipment called a Nuclear Enterprises 1600 gamma counter, and this was a 16-channel machine. And when the 16 tubes or wells were tested, only the first 13 results appeared on the printout display. This was before video displays. The display was a printout. And in order to see the result for wells 14 to 16, the operator had to wind on the printout to see it. And on this particular occasion, well 14 was positive, but it hadn't been recorded. So I'm pretty sure it was this Liverpool visit, and that what they introduced then was a double check with somebody else checking all 16 wells printed out, rather than just the first 13 that showed.
Am I right in thinking that you had no power to compel them to change any of their procedures? You had to persuade them instead?
Oh, it doesn't take much persuade. You're right. I couldn't thump the table and say thou shalt, but it doesn't take much persuading. I mean, these are very committed people. They don't want to send plasma donations to BPL, which will then potentially compromise a pool, and if we're asleep as well, potentially harm a patient. So it didn't take much to persuade them.
Following on from that, do you remember any incident in which you made a recommendation that wasn't accepted by the RTC?
I cannot think of such an incident.
I'd like to turn now to the relationship between BPL and the licensing authority, and particularly the NIBSC that you mentioned earlier. Before we get on to testing of specific products, I just want to ask one or two questions about the Medicines Inspectorate report on BPL that we saw highlights of in the videos earlier. You were at PFL at the time that that report was provided to the Medicines Division and to BPL in 1979. So you wouldn't have been responsible for responding to it directly. But am I right in thinking, from what you said earlier, that you don't disagree with anything that was in that Medicines Inspectorate report about BPL?
I do not disagree with anything at all. I think the only thing I would disagree with was, I would be concerned about, would be not reacting aggressively to address all of the issues in the appropriate way.
I just want to pick up on one of the issues from the report, bearing in mind your role at the time was not to respond to it on behalf of BPL. Something that the Medicines Inspectorate said was that under no circumstances should production of any product be increased at BPL until the plant had been brought up to standard. I won't take you to it unless you would like to see that, but you refer to it in your statement, so I think you're aware of that conclusion.
Yes, indeed.
We know through the Stopgap programme that production did increase at BPL between around 1978 and 1982. It almost doubled during that time. Do you know if this was done contrary to the Medicines Inspectorate inspections, or whether it was done with their knowledge?
I don't know whether it was done against that stricture from the Inspectorate. I haven't seen any correspondence that says this is shameful, it shouldn't have happened or shouldn't happen. I do know that, though I can't point you to documentation, but I do know the increases were done with Department of Health awareness. That's probably as much as I can say.
You, in your statement, perhaps we'll bring it up, WITN 3431001, page 138 and 139. Firstly, to be clear, I don't think there is any doubt at all that the DHSS were aware of the stopgap plans and the fact that those plans included an increase in production. Something else that you point to in your statement, and we're just bringing it up, is that there were a number of inspections that took place at BPL by the Medicines Inspectorate in the year, in 1981 at least, possibly 1980 as well. So at a time when the Stopgap programme was going ahead. I think we're having a little difficulty bringing up your statement, so perhaps I will just read to you from pages 138 and 139 of it. You pointed out that
we now have 138, but we don't have any highlight. That I think is perhaps the problem.
If we could go on, please. Well, first of all, before we do, we can see there that I'll just pick up this date now for future reference. February 1977, authority given for the grant of UK product licence to BPL and PFL. So this is a date that I think you've taken from one of the chronologies that you appended to your statement. So product licence granted in February 1977.
I recall that, and I think what surprised me was how long it actually took to reach that conclusion or to process that change. But yeah, it's a fact.
We can see in the entry above, July 1976, BPL applied for the UK licence for Factor 9. In April 76, BPL applied for UK licence for Factor 8. So a period of almost a year between the application and the grant for Factor 8. 1979, we can see the initial inspection of BPL at Elstree, and then the reports that followed. If we could go over, please, to page 139. Right at the top there, we can see March 1981, inspection, Ayling and Flint of BPL at Elstree, report communicated to RSL. RSL, Dr. Lane, is that right?
That's correct.
And then May 1981, inspection, Haythornwaite of BPL at Elstree. June 1981, draft report on inspection of BPL at Elstree. And then the next bullet point, there was at least one further inspection of BPL at Elstree between 1982 and 1985, but I don't have access to information or on dates or reports. Do we take it from this that it was your understanding, based on the records that you had seen, that there continued to be Medicines Inspectorate reports and inspections of BPL during the stopgap period, when it would have been obvious that production of the plant had been increased?
Yes, and I should make the point that out of all of those, or any of those inspections that I had any direct awareness of, the input of the inspectors was always very helpful and very positive. As a former auditor myself, it's always seemed to me to be particularly important that when you carry out an audit, and the MCA inspections are audits, when you carry out an audit, you provide the organisation with guidance on how they can respond to improve. Now, MCA would, at the time, would probably have taken the formal view that that wasn't their role. But on the other hand, the individuals involved, John Ayling, David Haythornthwaite, were extremely helpful on all of the occasions I worked with them in feeding back, have you thought of, why don't you consider? So yes, I'm sure they were aware of the increase throughput, and I'm sure they would have been very helpful in recommending ways to manage the circumstances.
Thank you. We can take that down. I'd like to turn to the question of the testing of products that were manufactured at BPL, and to do this through an exchange of letters that you had with Duncan Thomas at NIBSC in March 1982. If we could go first to CBLA 00155372. Can you see that on screen, Dr. Snape?
Yes, I can, thank you.
This is a letter from you dated the 15th of March 1982 to Dr. Thomas, in which you wrote, and I quote, "Dear Duncan, I'm writing to ask whether you would consider reviewing the basis on which samples of factor 8, factor 9 and plasma protein fraction are submitted to NIBSC for testing. As you know, samples are currently sent from one batch of each product every month. Do you feel that you now know these products well enough to reduce the frequency of sampling to NIBSC, perhaps to 2 or 3 batches per annum? It would also be valuable to us to have a chance to sit down with you and Trevor, or perhaps Philip Kerry as appropriate, and discuss our past performance." First of all, that describes the situation in place in March 1982, where monthly samples of each product are being sent for testing at NIBSC. Do you know how long that situation had been in place?
In another part of my report, and I can find it, but not without delay, I actually tabulated the frequency of submission of samples throughout all of the time we were submitting samples to NIBSC. I'm sure that particular arrangement was probably in place for a couple of years. You can read from it wasn't obvious to me when I reread that letter, but whether this had been put in place as a temporary arrangement, or whether this was seen as the beginnings of something bigger. I felt I had to challenge because, as the head of QC at BPL, I didn't necessarily feel we were getting good value for money from the testing. The problem was, and it's picked up in the second paragraph, we didn't get results back from NIBSC. I mean, real results. We got a nihil obstat kind of statement that allowed us to proceed. But it would be, my view was that if we were going to use these valuable samples, valuable vials of product, we should be getting more than that back.
Trevor, that you referred to in the second paragraph, is that Trevor Barrowcliff?
It is.
Is this arrangement an example of the slightly odd situation that BPL found itself in, that while it was no longer relying on Crown immunity, nor was it subject to the strict rigours of the Medicines Act 1968 in the way that commercial companies were?
Yes, it's one example, certainly. But it was a system that worked. I think if we had been aware at BPL that NIBSC were seeing things that we weren't, we might have been, I might have been more relaxed about continuing, or perhaps even extending it further. But the tabulation that I referred to earlier picks up those changes and is a good way to see it.
We'll look for that in due course, but if I can just take you to the letter that Dr. Thomas sent you in reply, CBLA 00155371. Dated the 17th of March 1982. Dr. Thomas wrote this: "Dear Terry, The question you raise about the extent of NIBSC testing of these NHS-produced products is not one to which I can give you an immediate answer. I will need to raise the issue with the DHSS and also with our Scientific Policy Advisory Committee. My own view is that testing one batch of every product every month is about right, although it may be possible to reduce the frequency somewhat. You will be aware that we test samples from every batch of the comparable commercial products, although I recognise that their batch sizes are usually much larger, and it was because of this that we restricted the amount of testing that we carry out on NHS-produced material. As far as discussing the results of our testing is concerned, you can rest assured that we would let you know immediately in the event of any serious disagreement between our findings and yours. As you know, it has not been the practice of NIBSC to discuss with manufacturers the results of testing carried out on their products. However, I will be very willing to have informal discussions with you about the results of our tests on your products, although I suggest we postpone such a meeting until Trevor Barrowcliffe returns in July. So that is the response of Dr. Thomas. If we could go on, please, to DHSC 301049. We leap forward 4 years here to 1986, but it helps to show what happened after Dr. Thomas had gone back and consulted with those he had to consult. This is a letter from you to Dr. Allison Smith of the Medicines Division of the DHSS, which is setting out in writing answers that you had given to her orally over the telephone in response to a letter that she had written to Dr. Lane on the 24th of July. You write this, if we could go down, please, Sully. On the specific question of submissions of samples to NIBSC, I offer the following information. Immunoglobulins. Samples from all batches of normal and specific immunoglobulins are submitted to NIBSC. Batch release is conditional on negative results in tests for anti-HIV performed at NIBSC, normally Wellcome ELISA, with confirmation by Western blotting as necessary, and BPL, Wellcome ELISA, only at the moment. This practice has been operational for all batches finished since April 1986. 2. Albumin products, factor 8 and factor 9 concentrates. Samples from one batch, the first placed at issue, each month are submitted to NIBSC. Batch release is not conditional on any tests performed, and indeed results are not returned to BPL. This practice has been operational since December 1977, apart from a break of about 4 months between September 1983 and January 1984, which resulted from an organisational failure at BPL. Breaking that down a little, I think I've answered my earlier question about how long that system had been in place, because you write there that it had been in operation since December 1977, one batch per month being provided to NIBSC. And it appears from this that despite your letter in 1982, that system continued. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes.
What was the reason for the difference in approach between immunoglobulins and the albumin and factor 8 and 9 concentrates?
The immunoglobulin testing was potentially more complex, and the testing of immunoglobulins at NIBSC was carried out in a different division from the testing of factor 8, factor 9 and albumins. But many of the parameters were the same, and the distinction between whether batch release was conditional on a negative result or not is that specifically the immunoglobulins were being tested for HIV antibody, and we would not have released product without a negative result in that test. At that time, I'm not word batch releases. My statement under Roman 2 is that we couldn't make release of batches conditional on tests performed because we didn't get the results back. We would have been holding product forever.
So you were performing your own tests on albumin factor 8 and factor 9 at BPL, and you wouldn't release the product until those tests had been conducted, but you weren't waiting on hearing from NIBSC before you released the product. Is that fair?
Yes, that's correct. We certainly would not have released batches of albumin factor 8, factor 9, or anything else until our own QC testing was complete.
Did that QC testing include testing for HIV by August 1986?
Possibly not. You've caught me unawares there. I perhaps should remember, but I don't.
That's perhaps
If we were doing testing, then we would have waited for that test result as well, I'm sure.
That's perhaps something we can look into in due course. Are you able to assist us about the break of 4 months between September 1983 and January 1984, which resulted from an organisational failure at BPL?
No, I simply don't remember, but I'm sure it was an honest reply.
Do you recall any incident involving albumin factor 8 or factor 9 where NIBSC contacted BPL to say that they had found something on a test that BPL had not found?
Not in the sense of a stop on release. I can remember a number of occasions, particularly with factor 8, but also factor 9, when I would have been contacted by probably Trevor Bartlett saying that they disagreed with our factor 8 assay or our factor 9 assay, and we would have to discuss whether labeling was at issue. I don't remember a situation in which our test results disagreed so violently that we had to relabel a batch.
When you say the factor 8 assay and the factor 9 assay, so those are assays that would show how much specific activity there was in the product that you had produced?
How many units per vial there were. And since the NIBSC interaction was normally with commercial companies who were selling by the unit, BPL was subject to the same considerations in terms of did NIBSC agree or disagree. Sometimes we disagreed, and we weren't always the ones at fault.
A final letter in this series, DHSC 301051, please, Sully. This is a letter from you to Dr. Schild at NIBSC, dated the 13th of August 1986. So a couple of weeks after the letter that we have just seen going to Dr. Smithies. What you wrote is this. Further to our telephone conversation yesterday, I would confirm that BPL have now been asked by the department to submit all batches of manufactured plasma products to NIBSC for HIV antibody testing as part of our product release procedures. I have interpreted this request as being additional to and not in place of for samples of factor 8, factor 9, and albumin products submitted to NIBSC from one batch of each of these products each month, in lieu of the sample submission appropriate for licensed products. I would be grateful if you would agree to the submission of 8 to 10 samples each week, about 450 per annum, for testing for HIV antibody by an appropriate test, presumably an ELISA test in the first instance, with confirmation as necessary by immunoblotting. The approximate breakdown of samples would be freeze-dried coagulation factor concentrates 250 per annum, albumins 150 per annum, immunoglobulins 50 per annum. Those are all expressed to be maximums. You then go on to discuss the arrangements for providing the results and the charges that NIBSC may levy. Are you able to help us with why this change of approach have been deemed necessary?
I'm sure it was because it was considered necessary that BPL should not be treated in any way favourably compared to commercial fractionators.
Perhaps unnecessary in light of the question that I've already asked, but from your earlier answer, does it follow that you cannot recall an occasion on which NIBSC identified HIV in a batch of BPL product that you had not previously been aware of?
That's correct.
You state in your statement, I won't take you to it, but at paragraph 71, at page 139 to 140, that following the granting of a manufacturing license for the new Building 27 facility at BPL, you say, and I quote, the situation with regard to control authority batch release was regularised. Does that mean that a more regularised process of delivering samples to NIBSC was put in place?
Regularised in the sense that samples and batch protocols from every batch of every product were submitted to NIBSC.
In part, was that a result or a function of having a greater production level at BPL, so fewer concerns about product being lost to NIBSC when it could have been provided to patients?
I would never have felt comfort. I always felt uncomfortable with using vials of clinically acceptable product for testing if there was no value. It reflected the fact that as a result of our licensing of products, we, like other manufacturers, had a duty and obligation to supply samples and to observe the results.
I'm going to move on to another topic. So before I do, I just mentioned for the transcript that earlier when I was referring to the BPL plasma specification document, I said that this was at paragraphs 55 and 56 of Dr. Snape's statement. It is, in fact, at paragraphs 55 and 56 of the additional statement that Dr. Snape has provided. They now form part of one statement, so there are two paragraphs, 55 and 56. It is page 132 of the statement that the BPL plasma specification is referred to, and the document, which is an early version of the plasma specification, is BPLL 301881_005. I won't go to it now, but I place that on the transcript so that people can find it in due course, and I will try to be more careful to give page numbers as well as paragraph numbers in due course.
If I might interject, Mr. Hill, my thinking around a summary of timing of samples sent from BPL PFL to NIBSC It's summarised on page 142 of WITN 3431001 in paragraphs 80 through 83 in my response to question 15, Rule 9, question 15.
Perhaps we can go to that. WITN 3431001, page 142. Thank you, Dr. Snape. Starting at paragraph 79, you wrote this: in summary, BPL, PFL submitted samples from one batch of each product type to NIBSC for unspecified testing every month from December 1977. Test results were not returned to BPL. BPL batch release was not conditional on the results of NIBSC testing. Paragraph 81. Samples from every finished batch of BPL immunoglobulins, PFL did not make immunoglobulin products, were submitted to NIBSC for testing for HIV antibody from April 1986. Paragraph 82. From August 1986, samples from every batch of BPL PFL finished product were submitted to NIBSC for HIV antibody testing. BPL PFL batch release was conditional on receipt of a negative HIV antibody test result from NIBSC. Paragraph 83. After licensing of BPL PFL finished products during 1989, samples and protocols were submitted to NIBSC from every batch of finished product, as well as a sample from every plasma start pool. BPL PFL QP qualified person batch release was conditional on NIBSC certification of every batch. That is your understanding of the situation?
It is.
Thank you, Sally. We can take that from the screen. Just a couple of quick questions about the relationship between BPL, PFL, and PFC in Edinburgh. Did you have much interaction personally with PFC in Edinburgh?
Yes, I did. Interaction with specific individuals, most regularly with Bob Perry, and who was by 1982 was director of PFC, and with Bruce Cuthbertson, who replaced Bob Perry as head of QC. I visited PFC in Liverton probably once or twice a year, really to spend time talking with Bob Perry and Bruce Cuthbertson. I think I was almost always invited to tour the facility when I was there. And separately, Bob Perry and I met regularly as members of a European Plasma Fractionation Association, EPFA, Quality Working Party, as well as at meetings with EMA in London. So, yeah, we were in regular contact.
We know from evidence that we have heard, and in your statement you refer as well to evidence given at the Penrose inquiry, that there was what you describe as a brittle relationship between Dr. Lane and Mr. Watt. Did that affect or impact upon your relationships with your peers at PFC?
Not at all.
Did you ever feel in any way inhibited about sharing information from BPL with colleagues at PFC on the grounds either of some form of institutional defensiveness or because of commercial considerations?
Again, I would say not at all. There may have been some situations in which I would make sure that either Richard Lane or Jim Smith were aware of discussions that I was having, so that they were not blindsided by something that I said that they were not aware of. But no, I had no inhibition about discussing issues with Bob Perry and Bruce Cuthbertson at PFC.
Do you recall any times when either Dr. Lane or Dr. Smith said, no, please don't say that to the PFC?
No, my memory is that they were always very positive and would always encourage communication.
In your witness statement at page 117, paragraph 14, you describe Dr. Smith's role at PFL and his role in research and development. One of the things that you say that he did was to liaise with Peter Foster at PFC Edinburgh on evaluation of product development and characteristics. And then you say this, and I quote, and where appropriate, shared resource. I've been asked to ask you what you meant by where appropriate, shared resource.
Where appropriate, in the sense that it would normally only be necessary in a situation where either we had something that PFC didn't, or PFC had something that we didn't have. For example, we didn't have the PFC dog model for Factor 9 product safety. And in that situation, it made sense, and we were made welcome of access to their product safety activities. They were better resourced than BPL for virology testing. We had no virology testing at PFL. We had virology testing at BPL, but it had been built up around testing for virus antibodies in hyperimmune immunoglobulin preparations. We didn't have an active virology research laboratory. So again, PFC were very supportive in that respect.
We should read your statement then as meaning that Dr. Smith and Dr. Foster liaised where it was helpful, where it was necessary, and not that there were areas that were not appropriate for them to liaise on because of commercial or other reasons.
I'm sure there was concern as PFL got closer to a final dry heat treatment mechanism, what I've called HT3, that produced 8Y and 9A. But that technology was, I know, shared with PFC, even though for different reasons, PFC elected not to proceed with that particular solution.
I'm going to turn quickly to self-sufficiency. We've already discussed this to some degree earlier, and I appreciate that you cannot, from the perspective you had at the time, particularly in the 1970s, you cannot give a definitive answer on why self-sufficiency wasn't achieved, which is a matter for the chair. But I do just want to ask you about something that you raised in your witness statement about the difference in definition of self-sufficiency between Scotland and England. It is at page 25, paragraph 67. If we could pick it up from the words "a coherent national service." In paragraph 67. You wrote this: a coherent national service in Scotland, interpreted self-sufficiently, simply and unashamedly, as the quantity of factor VIII to meet clinical need without importation of product. By comparison, self-sufficiency calculations for England and Wales reflected very clearly a determination not to restrict the prescribing choices of clinicians. Since these prescribing choices were being formed between 1973 and 1978, when imported commercial factor VIII was opportunistically filling the gap left by BPL's failure to supply, and then you give some internal references to your statement, it should be no surprise that clinicians and their patients in England and Wales would continue to choose to exercise these choices well into 1982 to 1983. If we could just break that down a little. Is it your understanding that a different definition for self-sufficiency was adopted in England and Wales to the one that was adopted in Scotland?
Certainly in England and Wales, the simple and I think very positive definition in Scotland. Can we just flip back to the previous page? Sorry.
Of course.
Yeah. BPL, or England and Wales, couldn't have laid claim to that statement of self-sufficiency being the quantity of factor VIII to meet clinical need without an importation of product, simply because product was already being imported, and in order for that to have been avoided, we would have, BPL, PFL, would have had to be producing the quantities of product that the country, that clinicians in the country needed, not by 1987 or whenever, but we would have needed to be supplying that quantity of factor VIII by 1978, 1979. In other words, hard on the heels of a decision to build a factory, or at least do something on the Elstree site to produce the larger quantities of factor VIII immediately after Lord Owen's 1975 intervention, because it would have taken that long to have the quantity of product that was appropriate by, say, 1980. But because we didn't, physicians in England and Wales had started to import commercial factor VIII, and the rabbit was out of the hat, and we missed our chance.
Do I understand that to mean then that regardless of the definition, the fact that England and Wales didn't get even close to providing enough product to meet clinical need in the late 1970s and the early 1980s meant that it was inevitable that clinicians who wanted to use factor concentrates were going to import factor concentrates?
Yes.
And hence, after that, self-sufficiency was always going to be harder to achieve, because as well as producing more factor concentrate, BPL and those who were supporting self-sufficiency would also have to persuade clinicians to give up the concentrates that they had been using in order to use BPL concentrates instead.
And the only way that that could happen would be that the products that BPL were able to supply were either better, more convenient, more acceptable to patients than the commercial alternatives that were being supplied, and could be supplied reliably in the quantity that was required, and that presumably we would have continued to supply at no charge to the service. PFL and BPL were not supplying at charge, at any charge at that time.
It wasn't until the late 1980s that we had the introduction of cross-charging for BPL
Yes.
products. And is it your understanding that self-sufficiency was achieved in terms of providing enough to meet clinical needs without the importation of products during the 1980s?
In England and Wales?
In England and Wales, sorry.
By the end of the 1980s, yes.
But not before the end of the 1980s.
I don't believe so.
Can we just...
well, sorry. Only if self-sufficiency means providing enough to fill the gap after commercial products have been bought and used.
Can I just go back, please, to the document that we had on the screen a moment or two ago, to the page that we were looking at? Thank you.
Page 25.
And it just, because Mr. Hill has just moved from this, and there's something I wanted to ask you about it. It's the last sentence on the page, which runs over to the next page. Since these prescribing choices are being formed between 73 and 78, when imported commercial factor VIII was opportunistically filling the gap left by BPL's failure to supply, it should be no surprise that clinicians and their patients in England and Wales will continue to choose to exercise these choices well into 1982 to 3. That can be read as saying that the problem with self-sufficiency was not simply one of BPL not producing enough, but it was the problem of clinicians not wanting to use what BPL produced anyway. What would be your comment on that reading of what is being said?
I think, sir, it's circular in the sense that I have no evidence that physicians preferred to use commercial concentrates rather than BPL or PFL produced products, but simply that the commercial concentrates were available as long as their regional treasurers would fund the cost. They were available, and at that time at least, there was not seen to be a reason not to use them. There was HIV/AIDS had not become associated with commercial concentrates, had not become an issue, and by then there was it had been agreed that what was previously thought to be a frequency of transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis being more associated with commercial concentrates than NHS concentrates. By 1982-3, Peter Kernoff's paper had clearly demonstrated that the exposure of previously untreated patients to concentrates had the same risk, irrespective of whether we're talking about NHS or commercial concentrates.
Could we come back to the page, please, Sally?
Page 25. WITN 343-1001, page 25.
Thank you. And good, thank you. In the light of that response to my previous question, can you help me with what you, or just expand upon it, what you meant to say when comparing the English position with the Scottish position, saying self-sufficiency calculations for England and Wales reflected very clearly a determination not to restrict the prescribing choices of clinicians. And that's plainly referring to a decision by government, or at least those in control of the system. It speaks of the prescribing choices of clinicians affecting the calculations. What did you mean to convey by that?
I think I was trying to get across a fact which I'm sure I've stated elsewhere, but I couldn't point you to it now. That it had always been made very clear to me that we should not seek to determine which products physicians chose. We should make available appropriate products out of which they could make choices. It wasn't for BPL, PFL to try to determine what products clinicians chose. Obviously, we needed to make our product available attractively and in sufficient quantity so that the choice became obvious.
Then may I ask this? Was there ever an occasion when the amount of product that BPL produced was not taken up and used by clinicians?
In the case of Factor 8, I think the answer is no. In the case of Factor 9, I think we have a situation there where, because BPL had been consistently able to supply both enough Factor 9, but also a product that was highly respected in use, the use of commercial Factor 9 was almost non-existent. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that it ought to, for it to work, we ought to have been able to supply the same service with Factor 8 as we had done for the best part of a decade with Factor 9.
Thank you very much. You can take it down now, Sally. Thank you. Mr. Hill, I think because of my questions, I think we don't necessarily need to pursue your question unless it's the very last that you want to ask for the day.
No, sir. The very last question I was about to ask is the one that you have just asked. So I'm happy to cede the ground.
So in that case, I'm sorry for trespassing a little bit on your tea time, but can we come back tomorrow for 10 o'clock? 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.